So I'm going to pass over to Sarah just now. So Sarah Moyes, the Plastics and Circular Economy campaigner at Friends of the Earth Scotland, who's going to give a bit of an overview and talk about our work and some of the things that are coming up. So Sarah, do you want to go ahead?
Hi everyone, I'm just going to share my screen with you all so you can see what I'm working on. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about the impact that we've seen that coronavirus is having, not only on sort of the campaign work, but I'm also going to look at things like the resurgence of single-use plastics that we've seen during this pandemic, also the change to waste management, the effect that we've seen on the petrochemical industry, and then finally, like, where do we go from here? What next after this is over? So first of all, looking at the campaigning side of things. So this year was meant to be a really big year for plastic and for circular economy campaigning in Scotland. We were expecting to see a circular economy bill. This is now being postponed in light of coronavirus in the current crisis. It was one of a number of bills that was sort of put on hold indefinitely. And while we're obviously disappointed that this has happened, you know, we understand why it's happened. The government resources have to go on other things at present. So right now we're looking at ways to get what we wanted from the bill and what we hoped would be in the bill through other means. The bill itself was going to be really important because it was going to tackle our overconsumption of resources. We currently in the world consume as if we had 3 planets worth of sort of materials, and also for waste, to absorb the waste. So we are completely over consuming and we need to tackle that. So this bill was going to look at that. It was also going to tackle recycling and plastic pollution. And one of those things that it was going to look at was the Latte levy. The Latte levy would be a 25p charge on coffee cups. So for example, when you go to the cafe and you buy your coffee, if you take a reusable cup, for the most part, you will get a discount. However, under the Latte levy, you would actually pay 25p more to get one of the cups from the store. And the reason why this is so important is because every year we get through 200 million single-use disposable cups in Scotland, which is staggering. It's a huge figure for just one item. So these were some of the things that were going to be tackled under this. Something else that has been delayed is in England, they were going to ban cotton buds, straws and drink stirrers. That was due to come into force now, but it's been delayed 6 months. And then also we saw the delay to COP26, the UN climate conference that was due to come to Glasgow at the end of this year in November, and has now been pushed back until next year. So firstly, before I talk about the sort of the resurgence of single-use plastics, I thought I would just talk about quickly some of the gains that we've made. We really have in the last few years made some significant gains when it comes to plastic pollution. We saw the ban on cotton buds in Scotland. Plastic stemmed cotton buds came into force last October. We can now find top-up taps like the one pictured. This one's in Glasgow. These are all around the country now in a lot of cities and towns, and it helps people to cut down on reusable single sort of plastic bottles of water. And we've also seen a rise in plastic-free shops that have popped up, both shops that you can go into in person and also online shops as well. However, in the past couple of months, we've seen a resurgence in single-use plastics. Both of these photos that you can see were actually I took on one of my daily walks. I live in Edinburgh, near the city centre, and the place is littered with masks and with gloves. Both of those were taken where you could actually see communal waste bins, only a few feet from them. And usually when I go out, I would say I see a handful every time I go out, lying around on the pavement and the roads. And we've also seen, so not only have we seen a sort of rise in the gloves and masks, it's also been plastic bottles of hand sanitizer have been on the increase. Now, I mean, during this time, of course, the priority is to protect people's health. That has to come first. But that doesn't mean that we should just be throwing these products away. We need to be disposing of these products properly. They're damaging to the environment, but they're also really unhygienic as well. I'm going to talk in a little bit about waste management services. And at the moment, some of those are suspended, but when they do start back up again, there will be workers that are going out and cleaning up the streets and having to pick up those products that people are throwing away, not knowing if they were infected or what was going on there. And if we don't get rid of these products properly in the bins that are available and have been near enough to the products that I've found lying about, then they are going to cause an increase in plastic pollution. Another thing that we've seen sort of on the rise is the fight back against reusable cups. I mentioned earlier that the latte levy would help to reduce single-use cups, but before lockdown even started, Starbucks decided that they were going to ban reusable cups. They would still offer you a discount if you took your reusable cup into the store, but they wouldn't let you actually use the cup. And obviously now we're seeing that a lot of those cafes and shops are going to start reopening. Some have reopened if they have drive-through facilities. Others are going to be reopening in time. And I guess now we're looking at like what will happen when lockdown ends. And will we see that actually the reusable cups are pushed away to the side for the time being, and we're using single-use cups instead. And just to talk about plastic bags as well, obviously we have seen a pushback again, like other items, on plastic bags. Recently, the Scottish Government approved that the levy, the plastic bag levy, the charge that you pay, would be lifted for 6 months. It doesn't apply to all bags, it only applies to food and drink deliveries. If you're ordering your food from a supermarket, or if you're ordering a takeaway for collection or delivery, there's no longer a levy on that. And the same thing is happening in other countries across the world. We've seen this happen quite a lot in America. California is now giving out disposable bags again. And Maine was due to introduce a plastic bag ban, but that has pushed that back. It's happening in a lot of other places. Across America, I just picked out a couple to sort of highlight that this is happening. Next, I was going to talk a little bit about the waste management services. For people on the call that are in Scotland, you probably all have wildly different waste management across Scotland. Every local authority is different, whether it's different coloured bins or different coloured, different material that can be recycled, different collection days. And we've certainly seen this during this crisis, that different local authorities have been reacting differently to this. We've seen that a lot of collections of waste and recyclable materials have been suspended or delayed. Like I said, it's been different from local authorities. Some haven't as much and some have had severe delays. Of course, when we think about this, the health and the protection of the waste workers come first, and we need to make sure that they are in a position where they're safe to be working. But I think what this has shown us is that we need to have a plan B in place. We need to have plans in place for when workers cannot collect the waste, because the response that's happened lately is that people were asked to store their extra waste, their extra plastic and glass waste at home. Now, this is only going to be a solution for most people with space. If you've got a garage or a shed, or you're in a more rural area and you've got space, you might have room to store that for a month. But if you live in a small flat in a city, you're a lot less likely to be able to do that. So it is only something that's going to work for some people for some of the time. And the risk here is that recyclable material will actually end up in the waste bin. Currently, pre-lockdown, the last figure for recycling in Scotland was just 44.7% of household waste is actually recycled. This figure isn't that high. It certainly has a long way to go. So we don't want to certainly go back at all on that figure by making more material that should be recycled actually going to landfill. I was going to talk a little bit about INEOS, and I know that when Andy does his talk, he's going to talk a lot more about INEOS in a lot more detail. But I wanted to touch on it here because in Scotland, we have the biggest producer of plastic in the UK, INEOS in Grangemouth. If you're unfamiliar with the area, INEOS is sort of central Scotland. It's almost between Edinburgh and Glasgow. Not only is it the biggest producer of plastic in the UK, but it's also one of the biggest in Europe. INEOS pollutes the whole way along the pipeline, from the gas that's fracked in America and the communities around there, to the communities that live along the pipeline that the gas travels along, to when it reaches Grangemouth. And what it does is it produces plastic pellets, and we've seen huge amount of pollution on the surrounding beaches around Grangemouth. Just last year, there was over 300,000 plastic pellets. The nurdles are these little plastic pellets that are covering beaches. Now, INEOS does have a zero pellet program in place, but it's clearly currently not working because of the hundreds of thousands of pellets that are escaping into the nearby environment. But what INEOS has been doing during this time is they've opened lots of hand sanitizer plants. They've opened some in the UK, some in Europe, and just last week they announced a few more for America. And one of the things they've done around the plant in Grangemouth is they donated 3,000 bottles of hand sanitizer to local care services that were in and around the sort of the Grangemouth area. And of course, we're not saying that hand sanitizer isn't vital now. Of course, that like a lot of the messaging that we talk about around plastic and coronavirus, we need to be protecting people's health. Of course we do. That's one of the most important things. But when that is over and when we look to the future, we can't forget about the pollution that INEOS has caused so far. We must continue to call out INEOS for the pollution that they've caused and hold them accountable for the long-term pollution that they've caused over the years. You know, INEOS has spent so long polluting communities, and right now it's looking to look after those communities with the hand sanitizer. So I guess the question then is, what will they be doing for the communities that live around their plant once this is over? How will they be looking to help? And what we've also seen from the petrochemical industry is that they want bailouts. We've seen a lot of talk during the coronavirus crisis of many different industries wanting bailouts. We've seen, you know, the aviation industry and airlines asking for it, and plastic is no different. In America, the plastic industry is asking for $1 billion to bail out. We've seen Petro INEOS ask for £500 million of support from the government for part of the Grangemouth plant. And we need to start asking ourselves, do we want these places to return to normal? I mean, these companies have been failing people, they've been failing the planet for a long, long time, and we don't necessarily want to go back to normal. You know, these industries, we need to look at what happens next. What is the just transition away from what they're doing right now? Because it doesn't look like we can keep expanding these industries which are polluting and fueling the climate crisis in such a way. So finally, just to sum up, I'm going to look at where do we go from here. So I kind of spoke about not returning to the normal, and I don't think there's a lot of aspects of life before that we maybe don't want to go back to. But the economy that we had was called a linear economy. It's one where we take materials from the earth and we make them into products and we throw them away. And another issue with this consumption of resources that we have, this throwaway culture, is that we've actually passed 100 billion tons of material consumption around the world for the first time, which is an incredible amount. And we're actually on course to have more plastic in the sea than fish by 2050 if we don't do something about it. So what are we looking for? Well, we're talking about a just and green recovery from this crisis. The Scottish Government recently stated that any economic recovery should build a fairer, greener and more equal society. And we completely agree with that. We think that any recovery needs to put climate change and cutting climate emissions at the heart of that. And for the work that we do, that's transforming our economy into a circular economy, one that reduces waste, reduces our reliance on the planet's resources, and tackles the plastic pollution problem. So yeah, that's me. I'll just stop sharing this.
And I'm going to pass on to Phyl Meyer, who's from Inclusion Scotland, who's going to talk a little bit about, Sarah touched on, you know, some of the things that plastic is really necessary for, and it's really important that we, that our campaigning isn't damaging people's health or bringing in policies that don't work for everyone. So I think Paul is going to expand on that and how we can make sure that our work is really inclusive and the right people are leading that and at the front of it. So Paul, do you want to take it away?
Phyl, hi.
Phyl, sorry, Paul's the interpreter. Sorry, too many people. Phyl,
No
sorry.
Hi everyone, and thanks very much for the invite to take part. Inclusion Scotland has actually been doing a fair bit of work in this area recently. I believe my colleague Susie Fitton was in a meeting with Friends of the Earth Scotland just yesterday talking about this subject. We've also been working with Waste Reduction Scotland, is that the name of the organisation? Yeah, I guess I'll start off with the somewhat negative side of things. That's what some of you might have heard about, and then come back to the more positive aspects of it. In the past, there has been significant issues with the way that campaigning on single-use plastics has failed to take account of the requirements of quite a large number of disabled people, and has unfortunately and unintentionally resulted in further stigma and disadvantage to those people. The big one, which some of you I'm sure will have heard about, is the straws issue. A lot of you will have seen that there was a very negative reaction from disabled people to the proposed ban on plastic straws. And you might not be fully up on why that is. It basically boils down to the fact that single-use plastic straws are uniquely good at what they do. The proposed alternatives to date are very often unsuitable for a number of complex reasons to do with why people need the straws and the way in which they use the straws. A lot of people, you know, not knowing any better, will just say, oh, you can just use metal ones, they're great. I've seen an advert for them, not realizing that someone with poor motor control over their mouth can quite easily damage their teeth on a metal straw, not realizing or not considering the fact that hot liquids can't safely be drunk through a metal straw. There's a lot of these issues that are not very well known. And the problem is that a blanket approach to banning straws cannot be completely solved by things like saying, oh, well, disabled people can make a special request, or disabled people can be prescribed straws on the NHS. All of those sorts of approaches would further stigmatise and disadvantage disabled people who already have a great deal of barriers that they are facing and additional difficulties that they have just trying to take part in everyday activities. So to understand why the reaction has been quite so negative and perhaps at times contentious and angry is you have to take into account that for a lot of the disabled people who are affected by this, every day is a struggle just to be allowed to get to work, to have a job, to take part in education, etc. And when someone comes along and tells you that now you can't even have a drink in the bar, or you can't drink your coffee, you're going to be angry about that. So how do we address that? Well, as I mentioned, Inclusion Scotland has been working positively on this issue because it's not all one way. Disabled people as a whole and disabled people's organisations like us recognise that the effects of climate change and the effects of damage to the environment that are coming down the road towards us are something that we should all be concerned about. And frankly, disabled people are probably going to get it a lot worse than non-disabled people when these things, as these things start to hit harder. So it is in the interest of disabled people to address these issues, not simply say, no, you can't do that because we need straws. So what we are trying to do is ensure that rather than it being an adversarial feeling between environmental campaigners and disabled people and their activists, we try and work together on this to ensure that we move forward in a way which takes account of the additional issues that disabled people face, while still getting us towards where we all need to get, which is a more sustainable society. As was being talked about earlier, the idea of a circular economy is really key to that. It's not just about straws. Single-use plastics for food packaging can be very important for a lot of disabled people. There are all sorts of things which, again, plastic is just very good at, and the available alternatives at the moment will create additional barriers for disabled people. But if we increase recycling, if we make it so that plastic packaging used for food, etc., is more recyclable, and there are better facilities in place to recycle that plastic, then disabled people can not be badly affected by the efforts to tackle this problem. Absolutely key to that is ensuring that whenever you're doing activism on this subject, whenever you're organizing a campaign on this subject, please make sure that disabled people are involved in that campaign. Make sure that you've proactively asked disabled people's organizations and groups to take part in the discussion about how you frame those messages, how you can avoid accidentally stigmatizing disabled people in the process. And above all, we would encourage systemic solutions, solutions that focus on asking individual people to make sacrifices. Frankly, they ain't going to get it done. The amount of plastic that goes into single-use straws is microscopic compared to the amount of fossil fuels that get used for transport and various other things that we could be having a lot more impact spending our time focusing on those things. So please bring disabled people with you on this. We do want to work with you. Please excuse those of us that do react a little bit angrily to your campaign, and understand where it comes from. When you're used to being excluded, it's hard to react in a open-minded way to things like this, but we do want to see that happen. Inclusion Scotland will be signing, I think it's a joint letter on this subject to the First Minister soon, and we have it, as I said, identified it as a priority area for our policy work for the year ahead, and probably for longer than that. So we're keen to engage and support our member organisations to positively engage on this subject as well. I think I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the questions, and I'm quite happy to maybe try and answer some of those on the text in the meantime, if that's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Phil. I think, yeah, I mean, everything you said there, I think, is a really important message for all sorts of climate campaigning, is that people who are typically more marginalized by society are hit hardest by climate change and by all of the related injustices, and those people should be at the forefront of all of our campaigns and leading those conversations. And if people do challenge you on that, then it's worth really listening, because they're probably right.
Thank you. If I can add just one more point I meant to say, another aspect to this is that the more that can be done to prevent the marginalized members of our society from being disempowered and excluded, the easier solving the problems of climate change is going to be. You're going to always get resistance from disabled people if something requires them to do more work or more effort, because at the moment disabled people do not get enough social care support. They already have to fight too hard as it is to do things. So anything you can do to help those issues will make environmentalism easier as well. And I say that as someone who works for a disabled people's organisation, disabled person myself, and an environmentalist. So it's all part of the same problem, and the more we can do to look at it in a big picture way, the better.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I just for some of the comments in the chat, I would just say, listen to what was said, that disabled people know best what's best for them, and we should listen rather than offering, if that isn't affecting you, then rather than offering your own solution to that. So just for the comments in the chat, let's listen to what was just said and remember it. Okay, thanks so much. We're going to move on. There's a lot of speakers, a lot of content in this. webinar. So our last speaker of the evening is going to be Andy Gheorghiu, who is a long-time anti-fracking campaigner. I think I actually first saw Andy speak back in 2015, maybe, at the Friends of the Earth Scotland AGM, when you were talking about the anti-fracking movement across the world and across Europe, when we were still really fighting that here. But he's also a policy advisor at Food and Water Watch Europe, and is going to talk a bit about the work against INEOS and wider plastics and petrochemical campaigning across Europe. So can I pass to you, Andy?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thanks a lot for inviting me and for giving me the chance to kind of like give a brief overview on what I'm working over the past, yeah, you've mentioned it, it's 8 years now, on the work on fracking, but at some point I've bumped into INEOS in actual fact, and realized that there's a connection and a strong and important one between the fracking industry and the plastics industry. And I'm gonna start sharing my screen right now. Hope it's working. Is it?
Yeah, we can see.
Okay, great. So I will, in actual fact, Phil, talk also about the link between the plastics and climate, and that the sector plays a huge role in increasing global warming. And unfortunately, up until now, I mean, we've done some progress so far, but up until now, this sector operates under the radar of the climate movement, I would say. So that's why it's really important to highlight this issue. I will emphasize or re-emphasize some of the things that Sarah has already mentioned. And I'll also try to dive in a bit into the international transboundary anti-INEOS campaign that I'm involved in. And I'm gonna start with this picture that kind of like gives you, you know, the story in a nutshell. You see in the background, you see a ship. These are ships that were commissioned by INEOS back in 2011, 2012. In the aftermath of the financial crisis, INEOS was struggling, and they were, in actual fact, thinking about closing down units at the Grangemouth facility. And this is the time when Jim Ratcliffe, who's basically the owner of INEOS, one of the richest men in the UK, tax exile, and someone who's constantly complaining about green regulations and taxes. This is the time when he came up with this idea of switching from naphtha, which is crude oil, to frack gas as a raw material for virgin plastics. And the reason for that is that the fracking industry has operated in North America, mostly the United States of America, in a closed market. So prices dropped. That's one reason. The other reason was that if you frack for gas, you'll find dry gas components. This is the methane that we're using for you know, generating energy or heating our homes. Or you will find so-called wet gas components, which is ethane, propane, and butane. And the petrochemical industry, in particular plastics industry, needs the methane to power the very energy-intensive facilities, but they need the other parts like the ethane, propane, and butane to produce virgin plastics. So for INEOS and Jim Ratcliffe, this was an opportunity to keep going on with their business, because there was an abundance of cheap methane, but also ethane, propane, and butane in the United States. So they've commissioned the ships, and they've established a transatlantic supply chain that is feeding their petrochemical facilities at Grangemouth in Norway. And there are plans to do this for Antwerp. I will show you another map in a few minutes. What you see in the front of the picture is a puffin. And the reason for that is that some of you might know, some might not, but Grangemouth is located in the Firth of Forth, and these ships, they drive up the Firth of Forth to the Grangemouth facility. And this is where INEOS produces a lot of virgin plastics. And unfortunately, there's a colony of puffins, endangered species, who are eating the plastic pellets and dying from it. So this is what this picture tells you. It's the story of INEOS and the Fracking for Plastics link, and also what it does to the environment. But going back just a bit, and it's starting from the overarching issue, starting from the point that I've already mentioned, it is very important that we realize that petrochemicals are about to rapidly become the largest driver of global oil consumption. And this is ahead of trucks, aviation, and shipping. As of today, the chemical sector, as a single industrial sector, is already the largest consumer of fossil fuels, accounting, as of 2018, for 14% of global oil and 8% of gas primary demand. The International Energy Agency expected, and I wrote expected because due to COVID-19, we don't really know how this will develop, but I personally assume that oil prices will bounce back, and we will have a similar situation that we had before COVID-19. So the International Energy Agency expected that cheap ethane consumption will grow by 70% until 2030. And this is in part due to the expansion of US exports to regions such as Europe. Why is that important? It's important because it makes us understand that the plastic crisis is not only a demand-driven crisis, but it is definitely a supply-driven crisis, meaning that as long as we have cheap raw materials such as fracked gas, we will have a flood of virgin plastic that will then end up being waste in the environment. So we need to pay attention to the upstream part of the plastic life cycle. This next slide gives you an insight into some of the results that were presented by the Center for International Environmental Law last year in a very interesting report that looked for the first time at the overall plastic life cycle emissions. And according to their numbers, who are pretty conservative in actual fact, the full life cycle of plastic, starting from the fossil fuel extraction and going up into incineration and decaying waste in the environment, this full life cycle could generate as much as 10 to 13% of our entire remaining carbon budget for a 1.5 global warming scenario. So again, it's very important. And at the same time, it also gives us the opportunity to bring movements together, the anti-fracking, anti-gas with the anti-plastic movement. And it also gives, for the first time, climate change a face, a dirty face. Whenever you have a plastic in your hand, please remember that this product has contributed directly to global warming. Now, going back to INEOS, this map gives you an overview of their overall supply. Here you have Grangemouth. There is the facility at Roughness, Norway. And again, they rely, in actual fact, on the cheap frack gas from Pennsylvania. And as I've already mentioned, they've already started establishing the supply chain. So these ships are going back and forth since 2016. If the supply chain is interrupted in Pennsylvania, and this is due to the fact that people are fighting pipelines that need to be expanded, but also a new pipeline needs to be constructed. Whenever INEOS can't get the gas from Pennsylvania, they're using Houston, which is the biggest petrochemical hub in the world, as another export point. And they now have plans to build the first new ethane cracker in the last 20 years in Europe at Antwerp, which is the second largest petrochemical hub in the world. And they also have further plans to then use Antwerp as a hub to retransport the frack gas to the other facilities at Cologne in Germany. And this map is nice and gives you a lot of information. But what it doesn't give you is an insight into what this means for the people and the environment in the ground. And I'm really trying to go very quickly over some articles that were published in relationship with the construction of the Marina East pipeline. Back in 2018, Sunoco, who's the main partner of INEOS, was fined $12.6 million for ongoing violations against existing environmental, health, safety regulations. But it didn't stop there. It just goes on and on. 2019, another fine of $313,000. This one is from January 2020. Lake Spill Ernst Marina East Pipelines, another $2 million fine. This one is from February. Pennsylvania approves $200,000 fine and orders remaining life study of leaky 89-year-old Sunoco pipeline. And the overarching issue for this project is the involvement of the administration of Governor Wolf. So the FBI is now investigating, in actual fact, the issue of Marina East pipelines. Now, I've mentioned that I've worked with the anti-fracking movement in Scotland and the UK, and so far we've managed to block INEOS from fracking the UK, and that's the reason why they now started to actually buy pedals in Texas, and this also shows that they desperately need to have the control over the full life cycle, over the full supply chain, because otherwise they are not able to make profits, basically. We've also looked at INEOS existing petrochemical facilities, and we've published a few issue briefs. This one looked at all their petrochemical facilities in Europe, and it's a very bad one. And this includes also a lot of accidents at branch mouths, and we're talking about gas leaks, explosions, spills, and so on and so forth. And another thing that is or might not be well known to a lot of people, as Sarah has mentioned it, is the structural problem of virgin plastic pellet loss. So when we talk about plastic pollution, we always, or a lot of time, we think of an end product that is somewhere in the environment, but in actual fact, the industry, and INEOS is the biggest virgin plastic producer and contributes therefore a lot to this pollution, the industry loses as a structural problem their first product, which is insane. And up until now, INEOS refuses to really take responsibility for that. And this is not only true for Grangemouth, but also for their other facilities at Antwerp. This picture here, I took myself at Antwerp. It's in a protected nature protection zone. And right behind from the spot where I took the picture is a facility of INEOS. That's another one. But nonetheless, this company has the nerve to put these slogans on their new ships that they want to use to transport the frack gas from Antwerp to Cologne. It says, "Keep our rivers clean." I mean, it's simply insane to see how they operate. And Sarah's also mentioned it. They're also trying to get a new government loan. I'm preparing an open letter that we will be able to share soon, calling on the Scottish government and also the British Prime Minister to not do that, to not bail out polluters. And because of all that, people along the supply chain are fighting INEOS and are working together. And this gives me a lot of hope that at the end of the day, we will be able to disrupt this unholy alliance or connection between the fracked states of America and Europe's plastic industry. Thank you.